The International Criminal Court should prosecute Taliban leaders for crimes against humanity for denying education and employment to Afghan girls and women. That is what the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education has said. Gordon Brown told a virtual UN press conference on the second anniversary of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan on the 15th of August that its rulers are responsible for the most egregious, vicious and indefensible violation of women's rights in the world today. The former British Prime Minister said he has sent a legal opinion to ICC prosecutor Karim Khan that shows the denial of education and employment is gender discrimination, which should count as a crime against humanity, and it should be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. The Taliban captured power exactly 2 years ago, in August of 2021, during the final weeks of the US and NATO forces' withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. As they did during their previous rule of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, the Taliban gradually reimposed their harsh interpretation of the Islamic law, the Sharia, barring girls from school beyond the 6th grade and women from most jobs, public spaces, gyms, even beauty salons that have been shut down recently. Gordon Brown has urged major Muslim countries to send a delegation of clerics to Afghanistan's southern city of Kandahar, the home of Taliban Supreme Leader Hibatullah Akhundzada, to make the case that bans on women's education and employment have no basis in the Quran or in Islam, and urged the Taliban to lift these bans. Brown said he believes if there is a split within the regime, with many people in the education ministry and others in Kabul, the capital, who want to see the rights of girls to education restored. He said, I believe that the clerics in Kandahar have stood firmly against that and indeed continue to issue instructions. The Taliban's chief spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid brushed aside questions about restrictions on girls and women in a recent interview, saying the status quo will remain. He also said the Taliban viewed their rule of Afghanistan as open-ended, drawing legitimacy from Islamic law and facing no significant threat. Gordon Brown has also said the Taliban should be told that if girls are allowed to go to secondary school and university again, education aid to Afghanistan, which was cut after the bans were announced, will be restored. He's called for monitoring and reporting on abuses and violations of the rights of women and girls. Sanctions against those directly responsible for these bans included by the US and the UK, and the release of those imprisoned for defending women and girls' rights. He announced that the UN and other organizations will sponsor internet learning for girls and support underground schools, as well as education for Afghan girls who've been forced to leave the country and who need help to go to school. According to him, there's a new initiative to provide curriculum through mobile phones, which are popular in Afghanistan. Now, during the 20 years that the Taliban were out of power, 6 million girls got an education in that country, becoming doctors, lawyers, judges, even members of parliament and cabinet ministers. Today, however, 2.5 million girls are being denied an education. Another 3 million will leave primary school in the next few years. Meanwhile, engineering student Sumaya Faruqi, who had to flee Afghanistan to continue her studies and is now living in the US, is the face of a new campaign launched this week by the UN's Education Cannot Wait Global Fund to combat the crisis, marking the 2-year anniversary of the fall of the internationally recognized government in Kabul. Under the motto, Afghan Girls' Voices, the operation is spearheading a global call to respect all Afghan girls and women's right to education. 21-year-old Faruqi finished high school in Qatar after she and 9 other girls from her robotics team, the Afghan Dreamers, left Afghanistan in 2021. She is now beginning her second year studying engineering at Sacramento State University in California. She says this campaign is meant to bring the attention of the world once again to the girls in Afghanistan and their education. Afghanistan seems to have been forgotten, she says. The Education Cannot Wait campaign will aim to raise global awareness around this issue via social media right into next month, amplifying the voices of Afghan girls and women just as world leaders gather for the UN General Assembly on the 18th and 19th of September. The near total exclusion of women from Afghan public life, including in education and employment, has become one of the major sticking points preventing the international community from offering aid and official recognition to the Taliban regime.
Today marks 2 years since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, reminds the de facto authorities that Afghanistan, as a state, has obligations under international law to respect, uphold, and promote the rights of all people without discrimination. We remain deeply troubled by the human rights situation, in particular the severe restrictions imposed on women and girls whose rights to access education and work, their freedom of movement and participation in daily and public life have been eroded by a series of discriminatory edicts issued since the takeover. The High Commissioner calls on the international community not to forget the people of Afghanistan, who, in addition to facing severe limitations on their human rights, are living through a dire humanitarian and economic situation.
All right, let's go back to Shri at this point. Shri, there is no doubt that everyone who had said that this was Taliban 2.0, it was probably going to be a more modern or reformed Taliban, now has egg on their faces, because what the Taliban have done in the last 2 years is to take the country, especially the women and girls of Afghanistan, right back to the Stone Age. The question is that while nobody can disagree with what the UN Envoy for Global Education, Gordon Brown, is saying, what has the international community really done in concrete or tangible terms to pressurize the Taliban regime into restoring the girls' and women's right to education and employment? All we've had so far is a refusal to acknowledge or grant legitimacy to the Taliban regime. And the young girl we just quoted in this story, Samaya Faruqi, is quite right in saying that Afghanistan seems to have been all but forgotten by the world.
Unfortunately, Neha, she's right. I don't think the international community has done enough to restore women's rights in Afghanistan. The way I see it, what's going on in Afghanistan right now is a systematic gender apartheid against women. Women comprise almost half of Afghanistan population. They are 48% of the country's population. And what Taliban wants to do is basically make them invisible. They're telling women not to be visible in public spaces, not to be visible in employment, not to be visible in malls. Basically, they just want to make sure that these women disappear. Now, how do you make that happen? Or how can you make that happen? How can international community allow that to happen in a country like Afghanistan, where 50% of the population, almost half the population, is at stake? So I think there is a lot of lever which the international community can pull if it is serious about helping the situation of women in Afghanistan. Now, let's look at Afghanistan's situation today. People below poverty in Afghanistan, 98%. That's a staggering number. So almost everyone in Afghanistan is living in poverty, right? And it's in desperate need of aid. So the international community can very easily start giving aid, but subject to certain conditions. And one of those conditions ought to be that women will have their rights restored, that they will have the right to go to colleges, get educated, employment. So these are certain things the international community can insist. Because, Neha, it's very clear that women form one of the most important pillars of any healthy, vibrant, peaceful society. If you subjugate women like this, then you're not just subjugating a handful of women or even 50% of your population, but you are condemning generations of population to a mindset where this becomes the norm, where it becomes acceptable. So this is a systematic degradation of women as humans, as individuals with rights. So I think the international community does need to come together to put pressure on Afghanistan in return for aid and make sure that women get their fair share of living, simple living, not even any fancy rights, but basic living rights. That even Quran, I heard you talk about Taliban referring to Quran and Sharia as the basis for all these actions, but that's wrong. Islamic scholars are very clear that nowhere has Quran spoken against educating women. In fact, there are many hadiths where Prophet Muhammad talks about how life, right to property, right to life, right to think, which includes intellect and education, is fundamental to all women in Islam. So this is some bogus claim which Taliban is using to subjugate women based on some improper understanding of what Quran actually teaches, Neha.
Absolutely. Fact is, Sri, it's been 2 years of a living hell for the women and girls of Afghanistan. They are clearly staring at a very dark future, and the international community needs to be reminded that it cannot look the other way anymore. Let's certainly hope that something changes for these women and girls.